Hello, welcome back. Okay, now last time we gave just a real quick summary of the Old Testament. Today we're just going to talk real briefly about what's in the New Testament. This was so hard for me to figure out what I was going to include and what I was just going to wait for next time because it's so easy to want to just and talk about so much. So I'm working really hard. I can make a short story long. So for me to make a long story short, that takes a lot of effort on little chatty Cathy me. So I am making an effort. So, okay, now as we talked about, the Old Testament's much longer. Something I'm not sure if I pointed out is that it was written over a much longer time period. And so it was written over about 1,000 years from the oldest book to the latest book. And then we had some time in between the Old and New Testament. Now, the New Testament is only, instead of like 39 books, it's only 27 books. And these 27 books were written over only a 40-year time period. And so everyone that is an author of one of the books, well, the true author is God, obviously, but the one who's attributed to writing it down is someone in that first century church, that first generation. And so let's start talking automatically about the first four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels. Now, what you may know is that the word gospel actually means good news. And what I think is so interesting is one way to think about the Gospels is, what they call a narrative. And so if something happened, you saw something amazing or whatever, you saw a car wreck or you're remembering a story from your childhood or whatever, you would have to say, tell me what happened. And so you would tell it from your point of view. And so they're not going to be exactly the same because they're all from different perspectives, but they don't contradict each other. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect. And so people that are not believers will kind of pick at that. But they're all easily explained, but we're not going to get into that right now. Okay, so now Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what they call the synoptic gospels. And that means it's the same telling. And so it sounds similar to the word we know, synonym. We had to learn in English class, right? They're the same. They're the same. And they are almost just, you can line them up very easily. They're very, very similar. Some's longer than others, and there's, some has more details than others, but they're very, very similar. Now, John is a little bit different. And John was written later. So, but it was still, not a long time later, but we'll talk more about that later. It's so hard to pick what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about. And so, but you may hear that term synoptic gospels. And that's kind of a phrase that they would throw around. And I'm kind of writing it down in my bulletin going, what does that mean? And so, my wonderful pastor was great to explain it in more detail. And so that just means they go together, right? And they're very similar. Now, John does not contradict, let's be clear, the first three. It's just later telling and a little bit more information. And so the first three are written very soon afterwards, and John's written a bit later. And so it's almost like, tell me what you did, and then like, tell me about your childhood. Kind of parallel, very general analogy, not exact. Don't quote me on that. I don't want some pastor coming after me, right? Okay, now we remember in the Old Testament, all those books of history, right? Well, the New Testament only has one. And I think that's so interesting. And we talk about the books of Acts. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell the story of Jesus. And it starts with, actually, Matthew starts with the genealogy. And we talked about how Jesus came and was promised to come through Israel in the line of David. And so Matthew is very clear about, here's the genealogy, here's the generations, and this is his where he came from, and he does come from the line of David, right? Just as he was prophesied about. So it makes it very clear, from beginning to end, the story of Jesus. And then it talks about his birth, and then we talk and goes kind of into his ministry, and then into his death. So that is the Gospels. They tell the good news of Jesus. Now, Acts talks about the history of the church, how the church got started. And it's so interesting. It's so much fun to talk about Acts. And so, but there's just that one book. Now we get into the letters. And the letters are so fascinating. Now, a lot of them are written by Paul. And one thing that is interesting about Paul is that he was someone who persecuted. He was, someone who actually killed Christians. The story is so fascinating. He was, well, and not to offend anybody, but I always thought of him as like, he's like the super Jew, right? He had the education, he was well spoken, he had done all the things, right? And then he had an encounter with God, and he changed his name. His name actually was Saul, and it was changed to Paul, and he became a completely new person. And his view, and so much more. I have to edit myself. So Paul is very important in the life of the church, and he actually suffered a lot. He became the persecuted, from persecutor to persecuted. And there's certain passages about the things he went through and the suffering he did. And so sometimes when I feel like I'm suffering and life is unjust, then you kind of just like, well, let's read about what Paul went through. And it kind of puts you in your place a little bit, or a lot of bit, as I like to say. I have made that phrase up. I say it just to annoy my youngest son, who gets mad because it's not proper English. So yeah, a lot of it, right? And so now within those letters, there's different types of letters, and they have different purposes. But one thing I wanted to mention, in all that suffering, many times Paul was put in jail. And while he was in jail, that's when he wrote a lot of these letters. And so I think it's just so interesting that sometimes, our suffering brings about God's plan. So that's just a fun thing to remember. But anyway, so back to his letters. Some of his letters are written to different churches. So he would travel, his missionary journeys, he would travel and then and visit these churches, and then he would write letters to these churches. And so that's what some of them are. Now, some of them are actually to the leaders of the churches. And then actually some of the letters are actually just general to all Christians. And what I love about the letters in the New Testament is it explains a lot of the conflict that was going on at the time, and how to handle it and how to view it, and misunderstandings that people had. I get so frustrated sometimes. Churches teach things that are like way off from what the Bible teaches. They are out in left field, right? And some of those things were happening pretty quick in the life of the church. And so Paul addresses those. And a lot of the same problems we had then we're having today, right? And so Paul and all the other letters, some of the letters address, what the Bible actually teaches. And so and the letters are just a treasure trove of what is truth, what our expectations are of the church, what our expectations are of our leaders of our church, and what are the expectations of our heart, which is our biggest problem, right? And then just general teaching and explanations of the Old Testament and how it applies to the New Testament. And then the very last book gets a lot of attention sometimes, and it gets a lot of misunderstandings. The book of Revelation. Now, this talks about the coming of Jesus, the return of Jesus, and it talks about the persecution that is to come. And so there's a lot of different Glenn, my husband had the most interesting conversation about, there are some people that are, some people are like wackadoodle way off in left field, but there are a lot of people that we highly respect that we disagree with on kind of like the timeline of things, how things happen. And so one thing I like to always remind myself and anybody else as we talk about the Bible is, some things the Bible is not clear on. And so I wish I could remember who said it. It was C.S. Lewis or Francis Schaeffer, probably C.S. Lewis, but one of those really smart, wonderful people that said, we should not shout where the Bible whispers. And so I don't think we should get too excited about trying to understand things that the Bible hasn't made clear. But we should work very hard to understand what it does say. So let's be, we don't want to be willy-nilly and just kind of do what we want to do. But at the same time, let's not read in too much, right? So anyway, and so that's the basic layout of the New Testament. We need to also remember that these letters and all of them are not in chronological order as they were written. And so if you get, I'm going to talk more about different kinds of Bibles here in a bit, but just remember a good study Bible has information in the beginning and and that kind of helps lay out the history, who wrote what and who's he writing to. And it's so important before you crack it open to kind of, who are we talking to? Let's put it in perspective, right? And so that's always very useful. And so many times, or for so long in my Christian walk, I did not flip through and look at all the appendices and the maps and all of that. And it really can make a difference to help understanding the transition from, if he's speaking to Jewish people, me not being Jewish a bit, and helping me understand where it's coming from and where he's going. So that's always very, very useful. So, but anyway, that's the overstory. Now, remember, when we take the whole Bible as a whole, remember, it's just one story. It's just one story. And so we've got the Old Testament and, we've got those first few books showing us that we are sinners and we have a need for a savior. And then we have the story of the Israelites, and it's showing how God is preparing for this Savior to come, and how it's going to be. And then we have the prophets giving prophecy, foretelling, foreshadowing, for the lack of a better word, that he is coming, that a Savior is coming. And it's very specific about a lot of things that it just could not be by chance. There's so much of Jesus in the Old Testament. We're going to talk more about that later. But anyway, and then we get to the New Testament, and it starts with Jesus comes. And then it comes with the time of the church. And then it ends up with Jesus coming and fulfilling all the prophecies all the way back. And it brings it full circle and how it all ties together. And so I know that if you don't have it in perspective, it can seem disjointed and it can seem really confusing. And there's a lot of some difficult language, it's not an easy comic read, right? And so I just encourage you to take it, passage by passage, book by book, and try to read it again and again. And get through the layers and understand it. So I'd kind of talked beforehand about, I love it when there's a movie and you see the whole thing. Then at the very end, you're like, Oh, the whole time it was pointing me to this subplot, and I totally didn't twig on. I'm a little slow sometimes. I didn't twig on. And so there's, there's there's a story. So there's like a story within a story, right? And so it's really beautiful the more you read it and the more you catch the nuances and you catch, um, quick example. Many of us know the story of Abraham and Isaac, and there's this promise he's going to have a son, and he's going to do this son, he's going to bless all the nations, and then he has to wait for like 100 and something years, and it's impossible. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen, and everybody started waiting, right? And there was problems because they were trying to not wait appropriately, and then he gets the son, right? And then the son, God tells him to place him on an altar and sacrifice his son. And then right before faithful Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, God says, wait, I have prepared the perfect lamb for the altar, right? Ta-da! New Testament. We've been waiting for the son to come. And there's problems while we're waiting. And finally the son arrives. And literally with thorns, the ram, the perfect lamb, or the perfect ram that was provided for Abraham was stuck with thorns, crown of thorns, thorns on his horns, thorns again, right? The perfect sacrifice was provided for us that blesses all nations. I mean, and that's just like 1,000 of the stories. I mean, it's just amazing. And so I'm enjoying walking with you and talking with you, and looking forward to hearing any of your comments and concerns and questions. And I look forward to talking to you more. Bye.